The morning of June 19th, 1944, above the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey pulled his Grumman F6F Hellcat into a climbing turn at 14,000 feet and watched the eastern horizon darken with aircraft. Not clouds, not a weather front. Japanese fighters and bombers, wave after wave, stretching back toward Guam like a swarm of locusts moving across open water. He keyed his radio transmitter and reported what every American pilot in Task Force 58 could now see with their own eyes. The Japanese Navy was committing everything it had left to this single engagement. Below him, spread across hundreds of square miles of open ocean, steamed the most powerful naval force ever assembled. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers. And standing between the Japanese strike force and those ships were 450 American fighters, most of them F6F Hellcats, launched in successive waves as radar operators aboard the fleet's vessels tracked the incoming raid with increasing precision. The numbers alone suggested a massive air battle, but what would unfold over the next 8 hours would reveal something far more significant than a simple test of numbers against numbers. It would expose the terminal collapse of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force, a collapse rooted not in courage or commitment, but in decisions made years earlier about how to train pilots, how to build aircraft, and what to sacrifice in pursuit of what the Japanese Naval General Staff believed would be a short, decisive war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The engagement that began that morning would become known to history as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, though American pilots would give it a different name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The title reflected not arrogance but genuine surprise at how one-sided the fighting became. Experienced American pilots, men who had fought over Guadalcanal and Rabaul and knew firsthand how deadly Japanese aviators could be, watched in mounting disbelief as Japanese formations fell apart under attack, as enemy pilots made fundamental tactical errors, as aircraft dove into the ocean without attempting to evade or turned directly into American gun sites, without executing even basic defensive maneuvers. Something had changed. Something fundamental had broken in the Japanese Naval Air Service, and the Americans were witnessing its complete disintegration in real time. The central question that this battle would answer, though American intelligence officers would spend months afterward analyzing the evidence, was this. How had Japanese naval aviation, once regarded as among the finest in the world, manned by pilots who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, deteriorated so completely that their aircraft could be shot from the sky in ratios that seemed almost incomprehensible? The answer lay not in any single decision or failure, but in a systematic series of choices about training, doctrine, and aircraft design that prioritized initial excellence over sustainability, short-term advantage over long-term viability, and individual brilliance over institutional resilience. The Japanese had built a force of elite pilots flying exceptional aircraft, and then constructed a system that could not replace those pilots or adapt to the realities of industrial warfare when the initial cadre was inevitably ground down by attrition. To understand what American pilots witnessed on June 19, 1944, requires understanding what Japanese naval aviation had been 4 years earlier. In December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, they represented arguably the finest naval air service in the world. The pilots, who flew from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku that morning averaged over 800 hours of flight time. Many had combat experience over China, where they had honed their skills against Chinese opposition and learned to operate in combat conditions. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that combined exceptional range, remarkable maneuverability, and adequate speed into a package that shocked Allied pilots who encountered it in combat during the war's opening months. The Zero represented a specific design philosophy, one that would have profound consequences as the war progressed. Japanese designers, working within severe constraints imposed by Japan's limited industrial capacity and restricted access to strategic materials, had made deliberate choices to maximize performance within these limitations. They built the Zero extraordinarily light, using minimal armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a lightweight airframe that sacrificed structural strength for agility and range. The result was an aircraft that could fly remarkable distances, crucial for operations across the vast Pacific, and could outturn virtually any Allied fighter it encountered in 1941 and early 1942. In the hands of a skilled, experienced pilot who understood how to exploit these advantages while avoiding situations that exposed the aircraft's vulnerabilities, the Zero was genuinely formidable. But those design choices created inherent weaknesses that became increasingly critical as the war's character changed. The Zero could not absorb battle damage the way more robustly constructed Allied fighters could. A burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire that a Grumman Wildcat or F4U Corsair might survive often proved catastrophic for a Zero, igniting unprotected fuel tanks or severing critical control linkages. The aircraft could not dive at high speed without risking structural failure, limiting the pilot's ability to escape unfavorable situations. It possessed no armor to protect the pilot, making every hit potentially lethal. And as Allied fighters improved, the Zero's speed disadvantage became increasingly pronounced, allowing American pilots to dictate engagement terms by choosing when to fight and when to disengage. Japanese naval aviation's training system embodied similar characteristics, extraordinary quality achieved through methods that could not scale to meet wartime attrition. Pilot candidates underwent selection processes so rigorous that only a tiny fraction succeeded. Those who passed faced training programs lasting 2 to 3 years, far longer than equivalent Allied programs, building exceptional skill levels through extensive flight time and demanding performance standards. Graduates emerged as highly capable aviators with refined skills and deep knowledge of their aircraft's capabilities. This system produced pilots of remarkable quality, but in very small numbers, and it could not adapt to wartime's brutal realities. The Japanese Navy operated under the assumption that quality would trump quantity, that superbly trained pilots flying highly maneuverable aircraft would defeat numerically superior but less skilled opponents. This assumption held through 1942, when Japanese aviators largely fought against Allied pilots who were themselves still learning how to counter Zero tactics effectively. But it contained fatal flaws that became apparent as the war progressed, and attrition began eroding the irreplaceable pool of experienced pilots. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 began the systematic destruction of Japan's elite pilot cadre. 4 carriers sunk, with hundreds of experienced aircrew lost. The Guadalcanal campaign that followed became a grinding war of attrition that the Japanese training system simply could not sustain. Between August 1942 and February 1943, Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 900 aircraft and their crews in the Solomon Islands theater. These were not just airframes that could be replaced through industrial production. They were experienced pilots whose training had required years and could not be compressed or accelerated without sacrificing the quality that made them effective. Japan attempted to maintain its training standards even as losses mounted, continuing to graduate small numbers of highly trained pilots, while the operational forces bled experienced aviators at unsustainable rates. The mathematics were inexorable. If you lose 100 pilots monthly in combat operations but graduate only 30 from training programs, the deficit grows larger each month. If those combat losses include your most experienced pilots, the ones who understand tactics most deeply and can teach others, the quality degradation accelerates. By mid-1943, Japanese carrier air groups increasingly contained a dangerous mix, a handful of veterans with extensive combat experience, and growing numbers of relatively inexperienced pilots whose training had been shortened by necessity but who lacked the flight hours and combat seasoning to survive initial encounters with improving Allied opposition. The Japanese Navy recognized the crisis but found itself trapped by earlier decisions. The training infrastructure could not be quickly expanded. Skilled instructors were desperately needed in operational units and could not be spared for training roles. Flight time required aviation fuel, which Japan's increasingly constrained logistics system struggled to provide in adequate quantities. The Americans were sinking Japanese tankers faster than they could be replaced, strangling fuel supplies to the home islands and forcing reductions in training flight hours. By 1944, Japanese pilot training programs that had once required 700 to 800 hours were graduating pilots with 300 hours or less, barely half the flight time of the veterans they were meant to replace. Aircraft production told a similar story of quantity achieved at the cost of quality. Japanese factories produced Zeros throughout the war, but manufacturing standards declined as skilled workers were drafted into military service and replaced by less experienced labor as strategic materials became scarce and substitute materials were employed as Allied bombing disrupted production and forced dispersal to smaller facilities. Late war Zeros suffered from quality control problems unknown in earlier production aircraft, engines that failed prematurely, airframes with structural weaknesses, control systems that bound or failed under stress. Even when Japanese pilots reached operational units, they often flew aircraft that were mechanically unreliable and built to lower standards than the machines their predecessors had flown. The Americans, meanwhile, had built a training system designed from the beginning to produce large numbers of adequately skilled pilots who would continue improving through operational experience. Flight schools across the United States graduated thousands of pilots monthly, each with 200 to 300 hours of flight time, trained in standardized curricula that emphasized fundamental skills and systematic tactical doctrine. These pilots arrived at fleet squadrons as competent aviators who understood basic formation, flying, gunnery, and combat maneuvers. They were not initially as skilled as Japanese veterans, but there were vastly more of them. They flew aircraft that could absorb battle damage and protect their pilots, and they operated within a system designed to help them survive their first combat encounters and continue developing their skills through experience. The aircraft that American pilots flew into battle on June 19, 1944, represented a fundamentally different design philosophy than the Zero. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had entered service in January 1943, developed specifically to counter the Zero based on careful analysis of captured examples and combat reports from Pacific theaters. Where Japanese designers had sacrificed protection for performance, Grumman engineers had built an aircraft that prioritized pilot survival and operational effectiveness over pure maneuverability. The Hellcat weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, almost double the Zero's weight. It carried more than 200 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot, engine, and critical systems. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, containing multiple layers of rubber that would swell when punctured by gunfire, closing holes and preventing catastrophic fuel fires. The airframe was massively strong, engineered to absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Grumman test pilots had deliberately crashed Hellcats into barriers during development to verify structural integrity, and combat would prove the design sound. Hellcats returned to carriers with damage that seemed incompatible with continued flight. Wings shredded by cannon fire, tail sections nearly severed, fuselages holed by multiple hits. They brought their pilots home. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, giving the Hellcat a maximum speed of 375 miles per hour, substantially faster than the Zero's 330 miles per hour. More importantly, the Hellcat could dive at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour without structural failure, while the Zero risked coming apart in dives exceeding 350 miles per hour. This performance envelope allowed American pilots to fight using boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude to build speed, making a single high-speed firing pass, then using superior speed to climb back to altitude before the enemy could respond. Japanese pilots flying Zeros could not follow these attacks or prevent American fighters from disengaging when conditions became unfavorable. Armament reflected the same emphasis on overwhelming firepower over finesse. The Hellcat mounted 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. These weapons, proven reliable and hard-hitting, could destroy an enemy aircraft with a short burst at close range. The Zero carried two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and two 20mm cannon in the wings, a lighter overall battery that required more precise shot placement. American pilots could spray fire in the general direction of an enemy aircraft and score damaging hits. Japanese pilots needed accuracy, their increasingly inexperienced replacements often lacked. But the Hellcat's most significant advantage was not visible in its specifications. It was easy to fly. The controls were well harmonized and predictable. The aircraft was stable and forgiving of pilot errors. It did not snap into spins without warning. It recovered from stalls smoothly. A pilot with 200 hours of training could climb into a Hellcat and operate it competently, and with 50 hours of operational experience could become genuinely effective. The Zero, in contrast, demanded skill and judgment to fly well. Its controls were light and sensitive. It would snap-roll without warning if mishandled. Its lack of protective systems meant that small mistakes could prove instantly fatal. The aircraft rewarded expertise but punished inexperience ruthlessly, and by 1944, Japanese naval aviation was fielding more inexperienced pilots with every passing month. American pilots received continuous tactical education through formal doctrine and operational experience. Squadron commanders analyzed combat after every mission, discussing what worked and what failed, disseminating lessons throughout the air group. Fighter directors aboard carriers tracked battles by radar, providing pilots with tactical information about enemy formations, vectors to intercept, and warnings about threats. Intelligence officers debriefed pilots systematically, collecting information about enemy tactics, aircraft performance, and pilot behavior. This information fed into training syllabi at flight schools in the United States, ensuring that new pilots learned from the experiences of those already in combat. The system continuously improved, incorporating lessons and adapting tactics as the enemy changed their approaches. Japanese naval aviation had operated differently. Tactics were passed informally from experienced pilots to newer ones within individual units. There was no systematic doctrinal evolution based on analyzed combat reports. Radio discipline remained rigid, with junior pilots discouraged from transmitting in flight. Squadron leaders made tactical decisions, and subordinates followed orders without the kind of flexible mission command that allowed American formations to adapt dynamically to changing situations. As experienced pilots died, their knowledge died with them, never systematized or disseminated. Each unit essentially relearned lessons others had already paid for in blood, and the overall force never developed the institutional learning that characterized American naval aviation. The Japanese strike force approaching Task Force 58 on the morning of June 19th consisted of approximately 370 aircraft launched in 4 waves from Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. The formations included Zeros flying combat air patrol and escort, Nakajima B-6 N-JIL torpedo bombers, Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, and additional attack aircraft. Japanese planners had conceived an ambitious operation. Their carriers would launch at extreme range, their aircraft would strike the American fleet, then recover at Guam and Rota, where land bases could refuel and rearm them before launching follow-up strikes. It was a complex plan requiring precise timing, skilled navigation, and effective coordination. It required, fundamentally, the kind of veteran air crews Japan no longer possessed in sufficient numbers. American radar detected the first wave at 130 miles distance, providing ample warning time. Fighter directors vectored Hellcat formations toward the incoming raid, while additional fighters launched from carrier decks to reinforce combat air patrol. The Americans had refined their defensive system through 2 years of Pacific combat, layered fighter patrols at different altitudes, radar-directed intercepts, and overwhelming fighter strength concentrated at the point of attack. By the time Japanese formations reached the fleet's outer defensive zone, they faced more than 200 Hellcats positioned to intercept. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from the carrier Lexington, was vectored toward a formation of Judy dive bombers escorted by Zeros at 20,000 feet. He led his division into an overhead attack, diving from altitude to build speed before firing. His after-action report, filed that evening and preserved in naval archives, described the engagement with clinical precision. The Japanese formation maintained rigid discipline initially, but when Hellcats attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, coordination collapsed. Individual aircraft broke formation attempting to evade. The Zeros that should have protected the bombers were too slow to intercept the diving Hellcats and could not prevent American fighters from making repeated attacks. WWII destroyed 6 Judy dive bombers in a span of 8 minutes, exhausting his ammunition on the 6th kill and watching it spiral into the ocean trailing smoke. His wingman accounted for 3 more. The bomber formation that had approached the fleet essentially ceased to exist as an organized unit, scattered aircraft fleeing individually toward Guam while Hellcats pursued them. WWII's experience was not exceptional that morning. All across the battle space, similar engagements unfolded with similar results. Japanese formations dissolved under attack. Aircraft fell in clusters. Some Japanese pilots never saw their attackers before being hit, victims of attacks from high altitude or from the sun. Others saw the Hellcats coming but could not maneuver effectively to evade or respond. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Lexington's fighter group, directed multiple interceptions throughout the morning, observing the battle from a coordination position. His official report noted that Japanese pilots demonstrated little tactical flexibility, maintaining predictable formations that Hellcat divisions exploited repeatedly. When attacked, Japanese formations broke apart rather than executing coordinated defensive maneuvers. Individual pilots attempted to dogfight Hellcats at low speeds where the Zero retained advantages, but American pilots simply refused those engagements, using superior speed to disengage and reset the fight on favorable terms. The second Japanese wave fared no better than the first. American radar tracked its approach, fighters intercepted well before it reached attack positions, and the result was systematic destruction. Fewer than 30 aircraft from the second wave survived to reach the fleet, and anti-aircraft fire from the screening vessels destroyed most of those. Not a single bomb or torpedo struck an American carrier. The third and fourth waves encountered identical defensive responses: early radar detection, overwhelming fighter interception, and devastating attrition. By early afternoon, the Japanese strike forces had been effectively annihilated. As surviving Japanese aircraft straggled back toward their carriers or attempted to reach Guam, American intelligence officers began compiling preliminary loss assessments based on pilot reports. The numbers seemed almost implausible. Pilots were claiming hundreds of kills, far more than could be easily verified through gun camera footage or corroborating reports. Squadron commanders instructed intelligence officers to review claims carefully, eliminating duplicates where multiple pilots had fired at the same aircraft and ensuring claims met verification standards. Even after conservative analysis, the totals remained extraordinary. The final accounting, compiled from action reports filed by all participating squadrons and verified against Japanese records examined after the war, confirmed that American fighters had destroyed approximately 375 Japanese aircraft on June 19. Total American losses numbered 23 Hellcats and 6 other aircraft. The exchange ratio exceeded 12-1, the most lopsided air combat result in naval aviation history to that point. Task Force 58 had effectively destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force in a single day of combat. But the raw numbers, dramatic as they were, revealed only part of the story. American pilots returning from combat reported observations that intelligence officers found deeply significant. Japanese pilots were making fundamental errors, entering fights with inadequate speed, attempting maneuvers that bled energy without achieving tactical advantage, failing to maintain situational awareness, and showing little evidence of the tactical sophistication that had characterized Japanese aviators earlier in the war. Gun camera footage confirmed these observations. Aircraft flew straight and level while under attack. Pilots attempted to outturn, pursuing Hellcats rather than using dive speed to escape. Formations fell apart under pressure rather than maintaining cohesion for mutual defense. Captured Japanese aircrew, interrogated aboard American vessels after being plucked from the ocean, provided explanations for what American pilots had witnessed. Most were young, with limited flight experience and minimal combat training. Several had graduated from flight school only months earlier, with less than 300 hours total flying time. They had received virtually no training in formation tactics, energy management, or how to counter the boom and zoom tactics American fighters employed. Their instructors had been junior pilots themselves, lacking combat experience and teaching doctrine that had been effective in 1941, but was obsolete by 1944. They flew aircraft that were mechanically unreliable, several reporting engine failures or control system malfunctions during combat. They had been told they were joining an elite force that would destroy the American fleet, but the reality they encountered bore no resemblance to that expectation. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was catastrophic. They had believed, because they had been told repeatedly, that Japanese spirit and fighting skill would overcome American material advantages. They had been assured that one Japanese pilot equaled 10 Americans, that Japanese aircraft were superior, that victory was inevitable if they maintained fighting spirit. Instead, they had watched their formations destroyed, their comrades shot from the sky in numbers that defied comprehension, while inflicting negligible damage on the enemy. The illusion shattered completely, irreversibly, in those few hours over the Philippine Sea. What survived was recognition that they faced an enemy with overwhelming material superiority, better aircraft, better trained pilots, and systematic tactical doctrine that their own service could no longer match. The war, they understood with sudden clarity, was lost. What remained was only the manner and timing of defeat. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet from the carrier Taiho, received fragmentary reports throughout June 19th as his strike forces failed to return. Radio discipline prevented detailed communications from aircraft in combat, and the destruction had occurred so rapidly that few pilots had time to transmit coherent situation reports before being shot down. Ozawa understood only that his strikes were not achieving their objectives, and that losses appeared heavy. The full scope of the disaster became clear only as the day progressed, and the carriers waited for aircraft that would never return. Of the 370 aircraft launched that morning, fewer than 50 survived to reach Guam or return to the fleet. Most of those had turned back before reaching combat, experiencing mechanical failures or becoming separated from their formations. The strike forces had been annihilated. Worse still, American submarines had penetrated the Japanese screening forces during the battle and torpedoed 2 fleet carriers. The Taiho, Ozawa's flagship and Japan's newest carrier, sank in the afternoon after aviation fuel vapors ignited following torpedo damage. The Shokaku, a veteran carrier that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, went down that evening. Combined with aircraft losses, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had destroyed Japanese carrier aviation's offensive capability in a single day. The Japanese Navy attempted to rebuild its carrier air groups following the battle, but the effort proved futile. The pool of experienced pilots had been exhausted. Training programs could not produce replacements fast enough to offset continuing losses. Aviation fuel shortages prevented adequate training for new pilots, even when aircraft were available. By late 1944, Japanese carriers operated with skeleton air groups composed largely of novice pilots flying poorly maintained aircraft. Some carriers went to sea with no aircraft embarked at all, serving as decoys to draw American attention while actual combat power resided elsewhere. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated how completely Japanese carrier aviation had collapsed. The 4 carriers of Vice Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force, serving as bait to lure American carriers away from the invasion beaches, carried only 116 aircraft total among them, less than a quarter of their designed capacity. Most of those aircraft were flyable only because of cannibalization from other machines, and the pilots were so inexperienced that formation flying proved difficult. When American aircraft found and attacked these carriers on October 25th, they encountered virtually no airborne opposition. The carriers were sunk or crippled, but they had already served their purpose by drawing American attention northward. They were sacrifices, acknowledged as such by Japanese commanders, because Japanese carrier aviation no longer possessed meaningful combat capability. Individual Japanese pilots continued fighting with skill and determination through the war's final months. Veterans who had survived earlier battles and retained their aircraft demonstrated that Japanese naval aviators could still be formidable opponents when circumstances favored them. But these were isolated examples, increasingly rare as attrition continued its inexorable work. The systematic collapse evident on June 19, 1944, represented not the failure of individual courage or commitment, but the inevitable result of strategic decisions made years earlier about how to structure a naval air service, how to train pilots, and how to design aircraft. Japan had built a force optimized for a short war, assuming that initial victories would force favorable peace terms before attrition could degrade their elite pilot cadre. When the war continued past 1942, when the Americans proved willing to absorb losses and build replacement forces larger than what they had lost, the entire structure began collapsing. The training system could not scale. Philosophy prioritized characteristics that became liabilities as Allied fighters improved. The tactical doctrine assumed qualitative superiority that could not be maintained once the initial generation of pilots was depleted. By June 1944, these accumulated failures produced the catastrophic defeat that American pilots witnessed over the Philippine Sea. Part 8. Aftermath and Legacy. The American victory. For the United States Navy, the Battle of the Philippine Sea validated every aspect of the force structure and doctrine developed since Pearl Harbor. The Essex-class carriers that formed Task Force 58's core had proven themselves as stable, efficient platforms for air operations. The Hellcat had demonstrated clear superiority over its primary opponent. The pilot training system had produced aviators in sufficient numbers and quality to overwhelm Japanese opposition. The radar-directed fighter direction system had converted early warning into effective interceptions. The logistics train had delivered fuel, ammunition, replacement aircraft, and spare parts in quantities that allowed sustained high-tempo operations far from American bases. Every component of the system had functioned as designed, producing a victory so complete that it seemed almost effortless to observers who had not witnessed the years of development, training, and resource investment that made it possible. The battle eliminated any remaining Japanese threat to American amphibious operations in the Central Pacific. The invasion of Saipan, which the Japanese strike had intended to disrupt, proceeded without significant interference from Japanese naval aviation. Subsequent operations against Tinian and Guam likewise faced minimal air opposition. American forces advanced steadily westward across the Pacific, capturing islands that would serve as bases for the final assault on Japan itself. Japanese forces continued resisting with desperate courage, but they could no longer challenge American naval supremacy or prevent the methodical advance toward the home islands. American industrial production ensured that Task Force 58's losses on June 19th were replaced within weeks. New Hellcats flew from American factories to forward bases. New pilots graduated from training commands and joined fleet squadrons. Damaged carriers returned to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for repairs that were completed quickly by shipyards working at full capacity. The fleet that had destroyed Japanese carrier aviation grew stronger in the months following the battle, while Japanese forces continued deteriorating as losses mounted and replacement capacity proved inadequate. The psychological impact on American naval aviators was profound and lasting. They had proven themselves superior to an enemy that had been portrayed as exceptionally dangerous and highly skilled. They had validated their training, their tactics, and their equipment through overwhelming victory. The confidence that resulted carried through subsequent operations, as American pilots approached combat with justified certainty that they possessed decisive advantages in every category that mattered. aircraft performance, pilot training, tactical doctrine, and numerical strength. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics that maximized their advantages and kept Japanese forces continuously on the defensive. For many American pilots who fought on June 19th, the battle became the defining experience of their naval service. Alexander Vrachiu's 6 victories in 8 minutes represented the kind of dramatic success that validated years of training and justified the risks inherent in carrier operations. David McCampbell, who would end the war as the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed victories, regarded the Philippine Sea as the engagement that demonstrated American naval aviation's complete dominance. Other pilots who achieved fewer individual successes still recognized they had participated in a historically significant victory, one that effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic threat. The lessons learned from the battle informed American naval aviation doctrine for decades afterward. The importance of systematic pilot training that produced large numbers of competent aviators rather than small numbers of elite specialists became fundamental doctrine. The value of aircraft that prioritized survivability and ease of operation over pure performance continued influencing American fighter design through the jet age. The radar-directed fighter interception system developed in World War II evolved directly into the sophisticated air defense systems that protected American carriers during the Cold War. The battle validated approaches that became permanent features of American naval doctrine. The morning of June 19, 1944, had begun with a Japanese strike force approaching an American fleet, confident in their mission and their capabilities. By afternoon, that strike force had ceased to exist as an organized combat unit, destroyed so completely that American pilots struggled to believe the one-sided nature of what they had witnessed. The transformation from confidence to comprehension, from expectation to reality, occurred within hours. But the underlying causes stretched back years, to decisions about training, doctrine, and aircraft design that had seemed reasonable in 1941, but proved catastrophic by 1944. Japanese naval aviation had built a system optimized for excellence but incapable of sustainability. They had created elite pilots through lengthy training programs that could not scale to wartime demands. They had designed aircraft that maximized performance through minimal weight but could not protect pilots or absorb battle damage. They had developed tactics that assumed qualitative superiority their forces could not maintain once attrition depleted, the initial cadre of veterans. These were not irrational decisions when made. They reflected Japan's strategic situation, industrial capacity, and assumptions about how the Pacific War would develop. They failed because the war did not conform to Japanese expectations, because American industrial capacity exceeded what Japanese planners had believed possible, and because the training system could not replace losses fast enough to prevent qualitative degradation. The Americans had built differently. Their training system prioritized quantity alongside acceptable quality, producing large numbers of adequately skilled pilots who would improve through combat experience. Their aircraft emphasized survivability, accepting weight penalties to incorporate armor and self-sealing tanks that kept pilots alive. Their doctrine evolved continuously through systematic analysis of combat results, disseminating lessons throughout the force rather than allowing them to remain isolated in individual units. These approaches required enormous resources, training facilities across the continental United States, vast quantities of aviation fuel for training flights, industrial capacity to produce thousands of aircraft monthly, and logistical systems to deliver everything forward to Pacific bases. But America possessed those resources and organized them effectively. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the decisive importance of sustainable systems over peak performance. Japanese pilots at their best, flying Zeros skillfully and employing effective tactics, had been genuinely formidable opponents in 1941 and 42. But by June 1944, circumstances had changed fundamentally. The veterans were largely dead or wounded. The replacement pilots lacked adequate training. The aircraft suffered quality problems. The tactical doctrine had not evolved. The result was destruction so complete that it seemed almost incomprehensible to those who witnessed it. Yet, It was entirely predictable given the systemic differences between how each side had organized its naval aviation forces. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buie, watching the eastern horizon darken with incoming Japanese aircraft that morning, could not have predicted the exact course the battle would take. But he understood, as did other experienced American pilots, that they possessed significant advantages: better aircraft, more thorough training, superior tactics, overwhelming numerical strength. When the battle ended and the kill ratios were tallied, those advantages had translated into the most one-sided air combat victory in naval history. The Japanese had sent their strike forces expecting to damage or destroy American carriers. Instead, they had demonstrated conclusively that their naval aviation service had been broken beyond repair, unable to challenge American supremacy or prevent the methodical advance toward Japan itself. The title that American pilots gave the battle, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, reflected not contempt for Japanese courage, which remained evident even in defeat, but genuine surprise at how completely Japanese tactical and training failures had manifested in combat. What they had witnessed was not merely a battle won, but the visible collapse of an entire military system, one that had seemed formidable 3 years earlier but had been ground down by attrition it could not replace, flying aircraft that could not match improved American fighters, employing tactics that had not evolved to counter American doctrine. The irony was profound. Japanese naval aviation had begun the Pacific War, as perhaps the world's finest, had achieved spectacular early victories, and had ended as a spent force unable to mount effective operations, destroyed not primarily by American skill or courage, though both were present in abundance, but by systemic failures rooted in decisions made years before the battle was fought. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.